Hello and welcome to Libero, the podcast about the most important of the least important things, as Gabriel Anno said to Jacques Ferrand in 1955. My name is Jack Pitt-Brooke, I'm from The Athletic. I'm joined today by James Horncastle. Hello, James.
Hello.
And by Jonathan Wilson.
Hello.
Now, James, you've just got back from Italy.
That is correct. Very much on brand.
What made you choose to go there?
Just checking if it was still there, like a good chief executive. Want to be on top of my company. No, I went to Torino because it was the Derby d'Italia, so the biggest, most bitter rivalry in all of Italy.
Was it good?
It was fantastic. Yeah, it was 3 lead changes, Thuram brothers both scoring for different teams, worldies. Some of the best goals you'll see all weekend. Çalhanoğlu, Yildiz, Adzic, 4-3, Juventus, Inter in crisis, Juventus on top. It's like the good old days.
Jonathan, where were you this weekend?
I was at the Manchester Derby. I'm still recovering from having spent 6 hours on Avanti trains yesterday.
Does it make you even more? It must make you even firmer in your conclusions about Ruben Amorim and his 3-4-3, and it's not working.
Yeah, I know this is not what we're here to talk about, but that first goal, the way Doku found space, is almost like if you draw the 3-4-2-1 on a page, and you would say if these players didn't really move, just that was the positions they took up. Where's the gap? Oh, look, it's there, and Doku just stood there. And even though United had 11 players behind the ball, there's still a space there. And you just think, United actually were all right for 20 minutes, but I keep hearing people say that this season. And you think, well, United being all right isn't really good enough. And it's certainly not good enough when they then defend like idiots for the last hour.
Yeah. I was at the London Stadium on Saturday for West Ham 0, Tottenham 3. That West Ham were extremely bad. Tottenham were pretty good. Lucas Bergvall scored a header that reminded me a little bit of Robin van Persie's header against Spain in the 2014 World Cup. So that was really good. But of course, listeners, you know this all if you have been following us on Instagram, where you can find us at LiberoPod. You can also find us on TikTok at the same handle, LiberoPod. Although I suspect that if you're listening to this, then you, like us, are too old for TikTok. But the big story this week is the return of the Champions League. The 18 games of matchday 1 of the league phase are spread over this Tuesday, Wednesday and rather non-canonically Thursday this week. Wilson, I assume you're doing the Low Countries triple header, which of course is PSV Eindhoven against Union Saint-Gilloise on Tuesday, Ajax against Inter, repeat the 1972 European Cup final on Wednesday, and then Club Brugge against Monaco on Thursday.
Sadly not. Sadly, I'm back on the Avanti and I'm going up to Manchester for City v Napoli, which should be good. It just, and it's nothing against Manchester. It's just the agony of getting there and getting away from there. I'm sorry. I wish both Manchester clubs were relegated to out of the league. It's just awful. Like the East Coast Main Line is fine. So I'd say the only clubs allowed in the Premier League should be London, South Coast, North East, and maybe Yorkshire at a pinch.
Haven't Newcastle got Barcelona this week?
Yeah, they have. Yeah.
Why didn't you go to that?
Well, it's not where I've been sent. I just follow orders.
James, what are you doing?
Well, I'll be following Jonathan on the Avanti, an Italian name for a train for the Man City Napoli game. But yeah, I wonder if Jonathan was the independent football regulator, is this the first thing you would address, Jonathan? You'd either relegate those clubs or basically push ahead with some kind of HS2.
Yeah. I'd say to Jim Ratcliffe, you're going for this public funding for your new mega stadium, get the train line sorted out first. And also, build enough hotels in Manchester, Liverpool also suffer from this, so that when you have a big game, or any game, hotel prices aren't £250 for like a really crap business hotel.
Well, I'm doing Tottenham against Villarreal on Tuesday night, which is it's quite interesting because it Spurs' his first Champions League game since the second leg of the last 16 against Milan in March 2023. Antonio Conte was manager. I think he had 2 games left after this one. Spurs were 1-0 down in the first leg, and they did absolutely nothing all night, apart from taking Kulusevski off of Davinson Sanchez with 7 minutes left when they needed a goal. It was an utterly miserable evening. I think everybody realised at the end there's no point in Conte being Tottenham manager anymore. He only had a few months left in his contract. He didn't want to sign a new one. The club didn't want him to sign a new one. Conte obviously pressed the self-destruct button 2 games later, and that was the end of that. But it's kind of I was thinking about that and Conte and the Champions League, and obviously you guys are going to see Conte's Napoli on this week, and it just had me thinking: do you think this was finally going to be the season where Conte puts together any kind of Champions League campaign? Because the gap, as I'm sure you know, James, like the gap between his amazing record in leagues, he's won 6 league titles across 4 different clubs, and yet in the Champions League he's got to the 1 quarter-finals ever, and that was 12 years ago with Juventus.
Yeah, where they were knocked out by Jupp Heynckes' treble-winning Bayern team, which made Pep Guardiola's job at Bayern a little bit harder. Look, I mean, Jack, when we were discussing themes for this week's pod and we settled on the Champions League, we'll get to this a little bit later, but you said maybe the Champions League is a bit diminished, maybe it's not as important as it once was. Maybe the far-sighted visionary manager that is Antonio Conte understood this 15 years ago. And basically said, no one's going to care about this. I'm just going to basically win leagues from improbable positions and make my legacy that. But I think, look, it'll be really interesting to watch Napoli against City on Thursday, because this is a Conte side unlike any other that's played in the Champions League. It's not a team that plays 3-5-2. It's a Conte who, over the last year, has been alternating, playing 4-3-3, 3-5-2, and now has basically definitively settled on not playing a back three. And, at the weekend, they played Fiorentina, and all the tactical wonks and the number wang people who screen grab stuff and put pointy arrows on it were like, oh my God, this is calcio relazionismo, this is relationism, because he's playing 4 midfield players. He's got McTominay, Lobotka, Anguissa, and Kevin De Bruyne, because he doesn't want to leave one of the 3 who were in midfield last year out. And look, they play this kind of short passing game. They're all sort of in a very narrow quadrant in the middle of the pitch or on the flanks. Wow, this is exciting. Conte is kind of really updating himself. But to actually look at his Champions League record, I think the thing you have to remember with Conte, and I am being kind of making the case for the defence here, the one pattern throughout his entire career is he takes over teams that have just undergone something traumatic. Okay, so with Juventus, back-to-back 7th-place finishes, he comes in, they're not in the Champions League. He puts them back on top, leaves, says they don't spend enough money, can't compete in the Champions League. He's on a boat in Croatia, he gets the Italy job. It means he's out of club football again for 2 years. Okay. He then gets the Chelsea job after what? The Mourinho season. They're not in the Champions League either. And then, he goes to Inter. They are in the Champions League. Tough groups. Barca, Dortmund. They play well. They're not good enough to qualify. Conte sucks in Europe, blah, blah, blah. Spurs comes in mid-season, midway through the Conference League. Clearly sacks it off, gets them into the Champions League. Napoli takes over them. They'd had a Mourinho season of themselves. They'd finished in mid-table, not in the Champions League. So if you look at the arc of his career, it's an awful long time that he's spent outside the Champions League. And he comes into these Champions Leagues basically saying, well, did you see how bad we were before I got in charge? This team's got a lot of learning to do. And he's doing the same going into this week's game against Man City. He was like, we have to approach this like we are pupils facing the masters, and maybe one day the pupils will become the masters. And I think that's kind of why Napoli are sort of perfect for Conte at the moment, because they're not a team with a European tradition. Like if he wins the league back-to-back, that's never happened before in Napoli's history. Yeah, the best Napoli have done in the Champions League is the quarterfinals with Spalletti a couple of years ago. So, that's my case for the defence when it comes to Conte. I'm going to rest it there, and Jonathan can now lay into him.
I mean, I was fairly convinced by that. Is he actually playing relationist football then?
Well, I mean, I have not I've tried to avoid relationist football, Jonathan, but this was the chat after the game on Saturday against Fiorentina, where he seems to be, instead of playing these rehearsed patterns that are kind of ABC from the training ground. You do this, you do that. Commit that to your memory and just do it over and over again. And if we execute it with the right timing, then it'll work, even though people know it's coming. That's sort of been Conte over the last 15 years. Now, with sort of De Bruyne, Lobotka, Anguissa, you've got a fullback in Giovanni Di Lorenzo who comes into midfield. You've got so many players very closely bunched together, all sort of interpreting space differently and intuitively, I would say. That, I wouldn't say it feels off the cuff because Conte is such a control freak that it can't be off the cuff. But it's very interesting to see how, by signing De Bruyne and not wanting to renounce one of the three midfield players who he thought were the most important players in winning the title last year, they are becoming a team that certainly doesn't have reference points in the way that they've had in the past. Don't play with two strikers in the way that Conte teams played in the past. So I think that's why people are maybe leaping on this relationism argument.
But I mean, that is fascinating, given one of the things he always said at Chelsea was that under Mourinho, because Mourinho likes his forward players to play off the cuff. Off the cuff is maybe the wrong term, but Mourinho's feeling is football is so random, you can't have these regimented patterns, and that attacking players have to be able to improvise. And his job is to instill the mentality whereby they'll make the right decision in any circumstance. And Conte's criticism was, no, modern football, you need these automations. If you practice the automation enough, you'll reduce the time it takes you to do it by 5, 10, 15, 20%. And that's enough to beat a set defence. So that seems like actually quite a significant, even if he hasn't gone full relationist, whatever that actually means, which I think is open still to some debate. But that still seems quite a significant change in his approach.
Yeah, I don't know whether it is because he thinks that's the direction he needs to go in order to be more competitive in the Champions League. I think it's more a function of these are the players that I've got. And, in much the way we were talking about Guardiola and Pepism last week is, what does that even mean? Does even Pep embody Pepism? Pep is a pragmatist, sort of looks at the players that he's got that year and what gets the best out of them. I always remember Conte when he was at Chelsea, the first press conference he gave, he described himself as a tailor. This is what all Italian coaches do. We are tailors. We have to basically custom make this team to fit as best possible the players that we've got. And Conte, Juve, he started playing 4-2-4 and then moved to 3-5-2. Pretty sure at Chelsea he did the same, and then they lost to Arsenal quite early on.
No. It was they were playing a back four. Then that Arsenal game, they were 3-0 down at half time. They switched to back three, and then suddenly went on a mad winning run and won the title.
Yeah, that's it. And so, but at the same time, he's always dressed his teams in 3-5-2, if you like. Whereas I think in the last year at Napoli, he inherits a team that had won the league playing a very fluid 4-3-3 with Spalletti, had really good wide players, one of whom left in January, which was Kvaratskhelia. And Kvaratskhelia, he basically had to make a decision on him. He was like, I can't make him a wing back, can I? I can't really make him a second striker either. So I'm going to have to adapt. And I think that has put him on a path which has got us to where we are now, where he is more flexible, he's more open-minded, and on Saturday night he was talking about the need to evolve with football. You can't stand still. You can have similar principles, certainly in terms of the amount of effort, physical training we put in and that sort of thing, but I can't basically stick to what has made me as successful as I am today if I am to be this successful in the future.
And sorry, Jack, I know we've gone off script, but can I just ask one more question on this? Because Kevin De Bruyne's obviously come from City, where the patterns are, if not regimented, it's a pretty structured way of playing. How is he adapted to that new and perhaps unexpected freedom?
Well, I was at the first game that they played against Sassuolo, and De Bruyne played. I wouldn't say he played everywhere, but he played on the left wing, or he would come short and play next to their number 6, Lobotka. He would often find himself in the same channel as Scott McTominay. And to be honest, he still does find himself in that kind of left half space, if you want to call it that. But De Bruyne has a lot of freedom now. And, sometimes it looks a little bit clunky. It's like, why is he over there? Do the players know, what those, having been taught a number of reference points, all of a sudden they've got a player who embodies not having one. But it really clicked at the weekend against Fiorentina. So, yeah, I mean, De Bruyne scored 2 goals in 3 games. One was a kind of cross that the goalkeeper didn't come for, it went in against Sassuolo. The other was a penalty on Saturday. So it's not like those goals are coming from open play. But yeah, certainly that Conte seems to have given him the keys, really, and was calling him a bit of a genius on Saturday. So he's maybe opened up new possibilities for Conte, and Conte is really rolling with them.
I think I'm interested about this point about to what extent does kind of intuitive football have an edge in a knockout like the Champions League, and I think you could certainly make a case that the brilliant success of Real Madrid in the last, ever since 2014, really, the number of times they've won it, does suggest that a more player-led approach is probably the best way to win this competition. The fact that Guardiola has actually, he's only won it once since leaving Barcelona, maybe suggests that if your style is too regimented, it's going to be a bit too brittle to survive in this type of competition. Do you think, Jonathan, that's true? And do you also think that the success of PSG, who I think do play a very, very organised, disciplined system, both with and without the ball, do you think that maybe suggests that you can win the Champions League even with a more organised, less intuitive style?
The problem, this is the problem you always have with, it happens with the World Cup, it happens with the Champions League as well. The data set is actually quite small. So I completely accept the interpretation you're offering there of the past 10 years or so. And I think there definitely is something in the fact that Real Madrid were always able to just find something to score a goal when they needed one in the final 10 minutes of the game. Whether that's to do with them having that freedom, whether it's to do with their self-awareness of brilliance, their excellence as players, the self-confidence they have, the self-perpetuating nature of, if we score a late goal today, that gives us greater confidence next time we need one to score another late goal, which then gives us the self-confidence again. And the converse of that, of opponents thinking, oh God, we're only 2-0 up with 10 minutes to go, they're bound to score twice. With the sort of philosophy-based approach of Guardiola, to what extent has his failure, and failure maybe is an unfair term, unfairly negative term, but the fact that he has only won one Champions League since 2011, is that because he had a couple of pretty unfortunate exits in 2010, 2012, and that then creates this neurosis which makes him second guess himself and do just crazy things like picking the back 3 against Lyon, for instance, which was just play the game, you'll win it. You don't have to win it perfectly, just win it. But no, the attempt to impose control led to the loss of control, which is, I understand why some people don't find Guardiola's football itself fascinating, but I don't see how anybody could not find the Guardiola psychodrama fascinating. And those habitual failures, or those consistent failures in the Champions League, have been a huge part of that.
Where do you see PSG this season, James? Do you think that they are still the team to beat? Obviously, having won it last season and been so good, or do you think that can you see a challenger from somewhere else?
I think PSG's 5-0 win against Inter in Munich left a very loud echo, and it was such a perfect performance from them that I think it kind of overshadowed the rest of their Champions League season. Because, they lost 5 times on the way to that final. And look, they did seem to get better and better from the springtime onwards. After that 5-0, the best football that I saw them play was the second half against City in January, where they ran City ragged, and they could have won that by an even greater margin. And then they signed Kvaratskhelia, and he gave them another level of unpredictability that I don't think they had. But I mean, still on the way to that final, I mean, they lost to Liverpool, and then they prevail on penalties thanks to sort of Donnarumma. They win control against Villa. They lost. And, I just still think that the final was almost the perfect expression, and the final has left that impression of PSG as being the future, unbeatable, young, unstoppable in transition, and also have the great kind of players in 1v1 situations to break down low blocks as well. And, I do wonder, can they stay in that groove? Can they get back into that groove? The Champions League is a very hard thing to retain. They should be in a very good position to retain it. But at the same time, there are teams that I think underperformed in the Champions League last year. I mean, I think the big disappointment really was Liverpool going out to PSG as early as they did, and feeling that they were cruelly rewarded for finishing top of the league phase by getting PSG. I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because Liverpool don't seem to be particularly balanced in the way that they were last year, as they've just added more and more and more attacking players. And does that mean the window of opportunity for them to win the Champions League has sort of passed? That sounds strange when they've kind of refreshed the team so aggressively. But they should be a contender with PSG.
What's your view on? I mean, the big thing really that they've changed this summer is selling Donnarumma, right? Like, it's quite unusual for a team on top of the world to dispose of their superstar goalkeeper. Do you think that's is that an attempt to refresh the style when they're on top, or is it just to do with an issue between Donnarumma and the club?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. I mean, Donnarumma wasn't signed by Luis Campos or Luis Enrique. I think he was the kind of last player in this kind of PSG group to be bought by the ancien regime, if you like. All the contracts done at PSG since were kind of incentives based. His was fixed. And look, with Donnarumma, whenever he goes into a contract negotiation and has the Rylas negotiating with him, they always seem to stall, and he always ends up seeming to leave for free, which I don't think PSG were willing to do, which is why they ended up selling him. As they did late in the transfer window. I wrote about this last week. I think, he's so good at one thing that it makes everything else look bad. He's so good at shot stopping that it makes his perfectly okay ability with his feet look worse than it is. And so, look, I do think it is a bit of a risk for PSG to go with Chevalier. I thought it was quite telling that after the game, the Manchester derby yesterday, Erling Haaland, when he was given the Man of the Match award, said, and maybe he was just being a good teammate who used to be part of the same agency as Donnarumma, saying, we should give it to Gigio as well, because, that what an incredible save that was from Mbeumo. That could have made it 2-1 and opened the game back up. So I do think having a top-class goalkeeper is important, because it's if we get onto should the Premier League teams have won more than they have done over the last 10 years, given their financial dominance, one of the reasons that they haven't is Real Madrid having Thibaut Courtois.
Jonathan, how do you see a big challenge to PSG this season, and if so, where from?
With that question, there's no problem with the question. It's a problem.
With you, Jack. It's a problem with you.
You as a host, you as a person. No, it's a problem with modern football that there is no answer to that is not obvious and banal. That the 6 English sides, like Liverpool, Arsenal, maybe City if they are getting it back, maybe Chelsea, who are after all world champions, have a chance of winning it. Real Madrid and Barcelona have a chance of winning it. Both have issues at the minute. Bayern have a chance of winning it with issues. PSG have a chance of winning it. Does anybody else? I mean, maybe an Italian club, but I'm not convinced really. So you're looking at a very familiar coterie of contenders, and the truth is that we won't really know what sort of form they're in till February, March next year. I think, and again, I'm sure we'll come on to this, so I won't overstress this point. I think there are issues with the fact that I'm naming 4 English clubs there, 4 Premier League clubs, and no more than 2 from any other country, which suggests a relative quality of the Premier League and therefore the debilitating impact that can have. Set against that, I think Bayern have really suffered with this. I think PSG suffered with it in the past, but managed to sort it out last season. That if you're not being tested week by week, then you can go a bit flabby and you can forget how to defend. And I think that's one of the reasons PSG, until last season, their Champions League template was look quite good, attack quite well. Oh no, they conceded some stupid goals. So that's kind of an unknown. And suddenly PSG, for reasons that I'm not entirely clear on, I'm not really seeing it explained why they were able to do it. But suddenly, that City game, and then the Liverpool game, they did lose. They did need penalties. They were the better side by far over the 2 legs. The Villa game, they came under pressure. They were the better side by far over 2 legs, which is kind of actually the PSG model of letting in daft goals, putting themselves under pressure they shouldn't be under. But they managed to be good enough that their quality overcame that anyway.
Yeah, it's an interesting one about the kind of predictability of the teams at the top end. Like I've always thought, I mean, this is not an original thought, that one of the big problems that the Champions League's had really in the last 10 years is that, I mean, City and Real Madrid have so obviously always been, I mean, City have been more or less the best team in Europe for the last 10 years, and Real Madrid are the best team at this competition. And so much the Champions League tended to come down to games between those two, or like which of those two was going to make it through to the end. And I certainly think City should have had a better record in this competition than only winning it once under Guardiola. Generally, it has always been Real Madrid who've gone further than them, and the lack of that. Obviously, there have been years where neither City nor Real Madrid have won it if one of them has made a mistake, but I think that's why, in a sense, PSG felt kind of refreshing last year, right? Because it was unusual to have a different team be so much better than everyone else. But it did get me thinking: do you think English teams, given the huge financial advantage that English teams have at this level now, do you think we can? At what point can we start talking about maybe a relative era of English underperformance, right? Because we haven't even had an English finalist in the last 2 years since City beat Inter in the 2023 final. And do you think? I mean, Arsenal seem to be creeping closer and closer. Liverpool, were maybe unlucky last season, although, like you said, PSG were better than them over those 2 legs. Do you think we need, Jonathan, to see more from the English teams this year?
I mean, probably, but it's such a there's a sadness to the asking of the question that we haven't had an English team in the final for 2 years. That should not be.
I'm pulling my hair out. This is why I went on the march on Saturday, because I was so angry. I felt so humiliated at having to 2 consecutive years in a row. I've had to sit at home and watch a Spanish and a German team playing at Wembley of all places, and then watching a French and Italian team playing the final last year. I can't stomach it anymore. I just can't
stop the goats.
But I think there is an issue that because the Premier League is so much more competitive than every other league in the world, and it's not just the fact there's 4, 6, 8 teams can win it. It's the fact that when you play your Brightons, your Bournemouths, your Brentfords, they're tough games. They're hard games. You can't play a load of reserves. You can't play for an hour and then rest everybody. You've got to take those games seriously. On the one hand, it makes Premier League sides tough. It makes them case hard. That means they're rigorously examined in every phase. But it does mean that maybe they don't have a freshness come March, April, May, when you get to the biggest games of the Champions League. And I think, would PSG have blown Liverpool and Arsenal away in the way they did if we saw Arsenal play PSG in the league phase and beat them quite comfortably. So it's I think fatigue for English clubs is an issue come the business end.
James, what do you? It seems to me a little bit like this argument kind of cuts both ways, right? Like on the one hand, people say, well, it's harder to be an English team, right? Because you're playing Bournemouth and Brentford and Brighton. They're actually pretty good. And that means that, Arsenal and City will never be at their peak in the Champions League. But at the same time, people make the opposite argument about, say, PSG, right? They say that, like, games against Lorient and Valenciennes are so easy that by the time it comes to March or April, PSG are sort of undercooked. So it's not clear whether it's helpful to have a weak league or a strong league to play against in order. Like, do you think there's an argument that people just twist both ways to drum up the conclusion that they want?
Yeah, I think. Look, I mean, it's been a surprise that in Ligue 1, for example, that in the time that Qataris have owned the club, Montpellier, Lille, and the other team escapes me, have won the league. Which hasn't always been all PSG's way. Like recently, we've seen a Bundesliga title race, I think, go down to the final day, and sort of Terzić's Dortmund bottled it. And we've seen, in Italy, I think 2 of the last 4 seasons have gone down to the final day. I actually think the kind of renewed domestic competitiveness in Italy, where you've had, I think it's 5 different champions in the last 6 years, has helped them in Europe. I think it's made the teams, more competitive. I think even looking back at last May's Champions League final, the fact that I think 4 or 5 days before it, Inter lost the title on the final day, was a factor. They'd been on the treble, and then all of a sudden, having sort of steeled themselves to try and do that, they go into that Champions League final thinking, actually, maybe we're not going to win everything, and they got vertigo, and boom, and they were maybe a bit tired by it. I mean, generally speaking, look, I think the Premier League, and I've said this over repeated podcasts, Rory wants to do a separate on it. I do think we are in kind of peak 90s Serie A Premier League at the moment, in that if you look at kind of 90s, you had, 6 Champions League finals which had Italian teams in it, and how many did they win? Not as many as they should have done. And that, I think, was in part because, Milan lost to Marseille, some suspicions around that Marseille team. Sam played against Barca, lost because of Ronald Koeman. But generally speaking, I think it was because that league was so attritional, so difficult, that those teams did get to those games. Battle harder than better for it, but also when it came to just that one-off game, it was a step too far. And I think the Premier League it probably finds itself in a similar situation, which means on the one hand you can look at it and be kind of Panglossian about it and say, oh well, look, the Premier League isn't being so dominant. Madrid is still winning, PSG are still winning, Dortmund have reached a final, even though they're super flaky. But the reality is that Premier League teams should be making the finals most years and should be winning more of them.
I wonder if there's an argument that La Liga for a long time had the balance right. If your goal is to win in Europe, that it was quite testing, but not that testing. So if you were Real Madrid, you did have to play Barcelona, Atletico. You'd have Sevilla. You'd have Athletic. You'd have Villarreal, who would, they're not easy games. You've got to focus on them, but you would have your Elches and your Alaveses and whoever down at the bottom as well. And that maybe there is a balance somewhere there. And La Liga, one of the reasons they were so good is that they had that balance.
Yeah, I mean, I think the worrying thing now is it feels like as good as Barcelona, or as kind of fun to watch as Barcelona were, their financial situation is such that they can't go out and strengthen in the way that they have done in the past. The best kind of moments of Barcelona, let's say when Luis Enrique won the treble with them, where they could go out and get Luis Suarez and they could get Neymar to partner Messi up front. They have got this very good generation of players that has come through the academy, but it does feel like Real Madrid are kind of on an island on their own. Really, they're almost exceptional and separate from La Liga. because of the money that they make, be it from that stadium. I was talking to an Italian executive the other day who was saying that San Siro, I think, makes 80 million a year from match day. That new Real Madrid stadium makes 320 million. It's stratospherically different. Madrid is set up to still compete, notwithstanding their kind of geography, if you like, in being in an important league, but a league that does not have the TV rights that the Premier League has, for example. So, in some respects, Barca are just so lucky that they have been able to keep finding a Lamine Yamal to have them, punch through these kind of financial restraints that they've got. Otherwise, that competitiveness that Jonathan alluded to, where they had it just right, could be loosened even more, and make La Liga even easier, if you like, or less difficult for Madrid.
And yet I feel like the reality for Barcelona is that they are, in this competition at least, they are under no immediate threat because of the new format. And we'll be talking about that after the break. Right, so this season is obviously the second season of the new Champions League phase format. And I think one of the things that we can be really certain of this week is that after the games, lots of people out there will be reaching some big conclusions about who's good and who's bad, who's going through to the next round and who's at risk of not. And yet the evidence of last season is that each of these individual games doesn't really matter that much. Like when you've got 144 games to turn 36 teams into 24, the jeopardy is clearly diluted, right? And this isn't just a theory either. We saw from PSG last season, they had 4 points after 5 games, but then they won their last 3 matches, scraped through to the punishment round, really destroyed Brest over 2 legs, and then they went on to win the whole thing. And it was a great turnaround, but it was also a really narrow path, wasn't it? But I think in hindsight, you can see that each individual match that you play out of your 8 between September and January isn't so much a big deal. There's not that much riding on it. Jonathan, I don't want to kind of kill your buzz before City Napoli this week, but it doesn't really, I don't want to say it doesn't make a difference. It's not like City Napoli was City's first ever game in the Champions League under Mancini. Sort of 13, 14 years ago, but it's just not as big as that, is it?
No, look, I'm looking forward to it. I'm particularly looking forward to it now that James has given me all the material I need for my sidebar. But I apologise for doing my research for that as part of the first half of this.
I did think you kept asking him questions.
I knew what he was doing.
So look out for that on Friday morning in the Guardian. No, but look, it's nice. It'll be an attractive game of football, but there's no sense of pressure or jeopardy. If one team loses, so what? I mean, look, if City had lost or drawn, I guess, against United, then there would have been a bit of pressure on that game. But the story would have been a Premier League story. It wouldn't have been a Champions League story. And so I think I was always a skeptic of this this format, which is not so particularly like the old format either. And you can you make the case, and I think you'd be correct, that the issue isn't really what the format is. The issue is the massive financial disparities within European football. But I think the problem with this format, and people sort of last season were, oh, look, there's all these big games. Oh, look, Liverpool have beaten Real Madrid. Arsenal have beaten PSG. Well, we now know none of that matters. And this is the problem I think this league phase has, that it's not like a small group where if you lose a game, you could actually be under pressure. It's not like a league without a qualification for next phase, because in a league every point really does matter. Whereas here, you get in the top 24, you're fine. You say however many games to reduce 36 to 24, but the truth is, of those 36, we could scratch 6 of them out now. Like we know that Kairat are not going to go through. We know that Pathos are not going to go through. You look at Leverkusen, the mess they're in, all the players who've left, and the Ten Hag nonsense. Even if they get through, they're not going to go any further. They're not a potential winner. So there's a lot of flab in that 36, and I think, and this is the problem that me as a slightly romantic football traditionalist has, that I hate the fact there were 6 English teams in it, because I don't think one country should have that much representation. But at the same time, I look at some of the other teams who are in it and think, well, you don't deserve to be here either because you're nowhere near good enough.
I think it's a shame, isn't it? Because it's also, so each individual game matters less, but also because what's been removed is the sense that the team that you're playing against, you are competing with to get out of the same little group. Like, there was a lot to be said for the kind of elegance of the 4-team round robin group, which 2 teams progress from. Like, because the stakes are clear every single time. You know where you stand with a 4-team group. Like, I was thinking earlier, like, why did the Steven Gerrard goal against Olympiacos in 2004 matter so much? Is because Liverpool and Olympiacos were both competing to progress from the same group at the same time. Like, only one of those 2 teams could go through in second place behind Monaco. And if Gerrard didn't score, Olympiacos were going to go through. But because Gerrard scored, Liverpool went through to the next round, and Olympiacos were booted out into the UEFA Cup. You're never going to get that this time, or it's much less likely that you're going to get that, given that there's 36 teams, and half the time you're playing. You'll be playing, any team will be playing against another, but where they are competing for completely different things, right? They might be competing for top 8, or they might be competing for the kind of middle band, or not to get relegated, or to just scrape through into the punishment round. And it gives every game a kind of exhibition-y feel, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think exactly that. And I do wonder now that people realise, what looks like City Napoli, the most successful team in England in the last decade against Italian champions, should be a big deal. It just doesn't feel like that. And I wonder now that we've sort of learned a bit more about the format, whether these games will feel less significant than they did last season, whether people will start to turn off. I also wonder, and I think we need to judge this sort of another 3 or 4 years down the line, but my suspicion is that we'll start to see a lot of games finishing in draws, or certainly games that are level after, say, 70 minutes, where both teams sort of think, you know what, a point gets us in the top 8, a point gets them in the top 24. We're both happy with this. Let's not exhaust ourselves. We'll sort of have a little nod between the captains, and you play it out. Now, I'm not sure there's any evidence of that yet, but I think once teams are more familiar with the format, I think that's a very logical and obvious thing that will happen.
Maybe I could see a bit more sort of targeted rotation as well. Like if you're aiming for top 8 and you need, I think it was 16 points last season, so 5 wins and 1 draw. I wonder if teams will try and do something akin to what Liverpool won their first 7 games out of 8. So maybe teams will think, if we just go all in on our first 6 games, we can effectively give our players a break in January for for matches 7 and 8. I mean, it's bizarre that there's European club football being played in January. It's or
I wonder as well whether teams will think, if you're Liverpool and you've got Real Madrid in the group stage, say, you might think, well, we're probably going to have to beat this lot if we're going to win the thing. Why would we play our first team here and give them a look at us?
Yeah.
Why would we show them our best hand by how we think we beat them? And so they play it like a pre-season game in the US or something. That, it'd be nice to win, but we're not that bothered.
And of course, Liverpool beat Real Madrid, didn't they, last year, in a game which kind of felt really big at the time. And yet, in hindsight, did it even mean that much? Like, I remember when Liverpool under Rafa Benitez beat Real Madrid 4-0 in 2009. I have much stronger, as a neutral, I have much stronger memories of that game than I do of Liverpool's 2-0 win last year, which didn't seem to, in the end, count for that much.
Yeah, that might just be you approaching 40. Like that's what memory does.
Yeah.
A couple of things to say about that. You brought up Rafa Benitez. Now, I always remember when Benitez was in charge of Napoli, I think in the first years, maybe 2013, they were drawing in a group with Dortmund and Arsenal, and they didn't qualify even though they got, I think, 12 or 13 points from 6 games. And if you look at what it took for teams to qualify last year to basically just get into the playoffs in this league phase, they played 2 games more and qualified with fewer points than what got Napoli knocked out in the group stages. I think 10 or 11 points, something like that, which I think some of the big clubs like this format because there is that safety net there of that playoff round, which means that, if everything does go wrong and you have the kind of season that City were having in that league phase, it doesn't mean you're out. It means, even from a commercial point of view, you get 2 more games. So you can sell out your stadium again, blah blah blah. So there's that. And then the other thing about this opening week, this time last year I went to Liverpool AC Milan at San Siro, first game of the new Champions League format. Big game on paper, a lot of history, 2005, 2007. It didn't sell out. And I think that was because a lot of fans were like, what is this? What does it mean? Should we keep our powder dry for other games? Granted, at that time there was Milan Fashion Week going on, so it's very expensive. Jonathan's complained about Manchester hotels. Milan hotels went through the roof in terms of prices that week. And ticket prices were up because it was the Champions League as well. So fans stayed away. But, I was struck by going to a game like that and it not being a sellout. So yeah, it feels like you get what the Super League has won, which is the big teams to play against each other more often. But there is that dilution of like, okay, what does this even mean in the long term? Final thought is Carlo Ancelotti is releasing this book about his Champions League campaigns. And one of the things he says about, sort of what he'd learned when he was sort of at Parma, then at Juve, and then at Milan, was like in the group stage, he was like, okay, I've cracked the formula now. In the group stage, get as many points as you can from your first 4 games, and then you can basically rest the players, rotate in the final 2. And going into the league phase last year, he was like, does this still apply? What should I do here? And it took him a while to sort of figure out. He was like, I experiment a bit. Oh, we've lost. Lille, damn. And then he sort of figured it out too late, where he was like, actually, no, should have tried the same approach. Win as much as possible as early as possible.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the top 4 in the league phase last year, 3 of the top 4 ended up reaching the semi-finals. The only exception was Liverpool, who were knocked out by PSG. And that was, as we mentioned, a bit of a freak that they found themselves where they did in the league phase in the first place.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how teams approach it. And from a public standpoint, so much of this format seems to rest on the idea that final day, which next year is on Wednesday, 28th of January, will completely justify the payoff of the first 7 match weeks. But the evidence of last season is that I'm not sure it does. I don't think it's quite the same. It's quite as powerful or interesting event as UEFA would like it to be, Jonathan.
Well, and they got lucky last year because Madrid has had a poor start to the league phase. They were safe by then. City and PSG had both had poor starts, and they needed results on that final day. So PSG were in Stuttgart, I think, and City were home to Club Brugge. So, yes, there was pressure, but it wasn't that much pressure. And then actually the experience I found of watching that final day was totally unsatisfying because it's just goals flying all over the place. Couldn't work out what was going on. None of them seemed to matter all that much. Everybody's getting very excited. Well, we've had 27 positional movements in the table. Yeah, one of them was like 12th to 13th. It doesn't matter. So it was similar to it's a bit like Niles Crane's description of ballroom dancing is difficult and boring. Which I have to say, you've both. Jack, you have seen me attempt ballroom dancing. I can tell you my experience. It was also difficult and boring. and I think that final day of the groups, it was difficult to follow. But even when you did, it was boring. There was nothing really going on, but in a very complicated way, it was very hard to follow.
Yeah, you get very excited, and then you check online, you scroll down, it finally lands. Olympiacos have moved up to 30th, and you think, oh, right.
Yeah, it's. I watched Days of Thunder recently with Tom Cruise as Cole Trickle, And yeah, in NAS, it's like NASCAR. It's just like it's like an Indy 500 of where there are so many teams on the grid that you weirdly end up, to find Jeopardy, you end up like looking at these back markers, just sort of going up into positions that, yeah, again, don't really have any meaning. And I think Club Brugge lost that game against City, but the Jeopardy, the TV moment for the Jeopardy was the Club Brugge players watching things on their phone to see if they'd qualified for the playoff round and who they would get. It was one of those things where all you need is one moment. I remember being on TNT that night, and it was like, oh, look at this, the magic of the Champions League. This is Jeopardy in action. We're seeing it right now. And it's like one moment across all of those teams, all of those games. And this is what we're focusing on here. And yeah, again, from a broadcast perspective, I think UEFA wanted to kind of pitch that final day as this TV extravaganza, this kind of NFL red zone sort of moment where all climaxes. And it was just a bit weird. Yeah, a lot didn't happen in those games. I don't know if you remember. I spent a lot of time talking, which I always think is the mark of a bad goals show night, when you haven't got goals flying in left, right, and centre, and you basically have no time to speak because we're going to Signal Iduna Park, we're going to the Park Stadion, and this sort of thing. And I was like, okay, it didn't work. And I did the Europa League goals show the following night, and that was similar, and that was mental. That was goals flying in all over the place. So. But yeah, as a broadcast spectacle, I'm not sure this league phase works any better than the group stage phase, I think.
Jonathan, do you think that these changes to the Champions League have diluted or undermined the prestige of the competition at all? Because, I mean, the knockout phase is no different, right? Like, once you get past the punishment round, it's the same. It looks the same as it was. So, do you think it's just is the issue just too much volume in the first half, or do you think anything else has kind of fundamentally changed about this competition, which makes it matter less, be less significant than it used to be, let's say 10 or 15 years ago?
I think from last 16 quarterfinals onwards, to be honest, even the punishment round, the City Real Madrid was a big spectacle. I was the first leg. I was doing an event at the Argentinian embassy, and I had a taxi waiting outside for me. And the thing started late because Ozzy Ardiles turned up late. So I had to break off a conversation with Mauricio Pochettino to race outside to get my taxi to come home to watch it. So that did feel big, because if you have two big teams playing each other in a knockout game, that's exciting. But is it diluted in the earlier stage? Yeah, it definitely is, because it's just none of it matters. None of it's leading to elimination. Elimination is what matters. So you compare that to the 90s, and every game in the 90s groups felt massive. That group that United had in 98-9 when they were with Bayern and Barcelona and Bernabeu. And okay, Bernabeu ended up getting hammered a few times. But the level of football was extraordinary. Even when United were playing, they seemed to play Sturm Graz or Panathinaikos every other week. But even those were Rapid Vienna. Even those were massive games. The famous Schmeichel save against Rapid Vienna. Donnarumma could make 1,000 saves against Rapid Vienna in this season, and nobody would remember because it's only Rapid Vienna. It's the pre-Christmas or the pre-January phase of the Champions League. It's definitely lost the excitement and the allure that it used to have.
And James, do you think that this, if we're looking at the sort of standing or the prestige of the Champions League, to what extent do you think it's undermined by the existence of the Club World Cup? Because in my opinion, I think that obviously no one can change the fact that PSG are European champions, but the fact that there was a different competition put on by a different organising body, basically a month after the Champions League final, and then PSG lost the final of that and are therefore not world champions because Chelsea are. To me, that kind of that represents a bit of the drinking of the Champions League's milkshake. I think that it doesn't. It weakens the claims made by the team that wins this, right? Because they are not really on top of the world.
It does. And look, I mean, that's a new competition. Well, it's a new format of an old competition, expanded. But look, I think if the Club World Cups begins to happen every 2 years on a more regular basis, that is going to be a problem for the Champions League, particularly if a Club World Cup, this kind of chaotically organised, can still be heralded, with some self-interest by FIFA as a success. But you look at how much money they were able to distribute to the teams that competed. Chelsea made more than 100 million from it. You're talking about almost Champions League parity, not quite, but that's the first edition of this new competition with DAZN as the principal broadcaster. If all of a sudden in the next edition you're getting genuine competition and auction to basically show those games, and more money comes into it.
I think it's really good that you've made a positive point, because we get told off in the comments for moaning too much about modern football. So we should try and integrate a little bit more positivity into what we say. Jonathan, do you have a positive message about the Champions League to round off this episode with?
Look, by the time we get the stuff that matters in the spring, it's great. That semi-final, the Inter-Barca semi-final last year, was the most fun pair of games we had last season. I'm not sure that the way we get there is necessarily the best.
I'll take it. I mean, for you, that's positive. We'll take it. That's all we've got time for on this week's Libero. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much to James, Jonathan, and producer Tom. I hope you guys all enjoy the start of the Champions League phase this week. We will be back again next week. Before then, you could do us all a big favour by just subscribing, rating, reviewing, commenting, speaking to us on social media. And we look forward to speaking to you again later this week.